My name is Patrick Doyle, reporting with the Daily Aztec. I'm sitting here with former U.S. State Department employee, nonprofit leader, and candidate for California's 53rd Congressional District, Sara Jacobs. Ms. Jacobs, thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
I want to start with a question about homelessness. You've made it clear that homelessness is an important issue to you as it is to many San Diegans, but I want to ask you about ending the homelessness crisis specifically during this pandemic. When a vaccine eventually is made available, do you think it should be free for everyone? And if so, how do you ensure a homeless population has access to it?
Thank you for the question. We know that we had a crisis in people experiencing homelessness even before this pandemic, and it's only been made worse. We are seeing so much suffering and struggling. I talk to people in the district all the time who, especially now that the extra unemployment benefits have expired, really don't know how they're going to make ends meet and how they're going to be able to pay rent or their mortgage and make it through. So first of all, on homelessness in general, we are the fourth largest homeless population in the country here in San Diego, even before this crisis. But we're actually only 20th in terms of the funding that we get from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So I think we need to modernize the funding formula so that San Diego actually gets the funding that we need to address this crisis from the federal government. I also think we need federal programs that fund homelessness prevention. So New York actually did a pilot program where they provided counsel in eviction court. And by doing that, they were able to decrease the eviction rate by a huge amount. And we know that preventing homelessness is both better for families and also less costly for the government than addressing it if people become unsheltered. That was true before the crisis. It's even more true now as these eviction moratoriums are beginning to expire. First of all, I think we need to extend the nationwide eviction and foreclosure moratorium, be giving billions of dollars in rental and homeowners assistance in whatever next package Congress is able to pass. And we need to be looking at all the different ways we can work on this prevention program, both during the crisis and more long-term. In terms of the vaccine, I absolutely believe that it should be free for everybody. And actually, having worked at UNICEF, I can tell you that figuring out how you distribute a vaccine is often the much harder challenge than developing the vaccine to begin with. We don't yet know if this is going to be a vaccine that requires a cold chain. There's a lot of moving pieces that we don't know yet. And figuring out how to do the distribution in an equitable way, it's going to be the next big challenge. I think that making sure that we are funding community-based organizations that already have relationships with people who are experiencing homelessness is going to be incredibly important, because we know that that trust component is one of the most important things that you need to be able to distribute a vaccine to populations that tend to be more skeptical of the healthcare sector. And we're going to need to make sure at the federal level we're funding not only the vaccine so that it can be free, but also funding these community-based organizations to do the distributions.
Wonderful. All right. I want to move on now to an issue very important to college students like myself, specifically people who have graduated from college, about student debt. Last year, NBC7 Investigates postulated that based on data from the National Student Loan Average, over 400,000 San Diegans likely still have student loan debt. On your website, you state that you would try to provide debt forgiveness options, but what specifically is your plan to ease the burden of already existing student loan debt in your district right now?
It's a good question, and as a millennial, I can tell you that this is something that I hear about all the time, and I have so many friends who are really struggling under the weight of student debt, who basically work to pay off their debt, which means that they can't invest in new businesses, they can't buy a home, they can't do all these other things, which is really a drag on our economy, let alone the fact that it means that our millennial generation is not able to have the same standard of living as previous generations. So, I think we need to allow student loan debt to be refinanced. We have historically low interest rates right now. I think we need to be able to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy. I personally believe that the most progressive thing we can do is have more targeted approaches to student loan forgiveness. So for instance, vastly expand the public service loan forgiveness program so that it is not only the very narrow approach now, but all these professions that we know we need more people going into, like teaching, like nursing, like the care economy, and also this public service loan forgiveness program right now is one of the lowest utilized programs, meaning that the amount of people who are eligible but don't actually receive the benefit is quite high. So we also need to reduce the administrative burden of that program. For instance, you have to certify your income every year to get that loan forgiveness, but you're paying taxes. The IRS knows how much money you're making every year. So it should actually be opposite. They should just send to you, is this still accurate, yes or no, so that everyone who is eligible for that program is actually able to get it. And lastly, the people who are most impacted by student debt are those who have debt but never actually finished the degree that they took debt out for, because it means they have the burden of the debt without the benefit at the end. And for those, I think we do need targeted student loan forgiveness and targeted programs to help them to finish their degrees.
Do you support a freeze on student loan debt payments during this pandemic?
Yes.
Okay. I want to move on now to a question about schools. There's been a lot of discussion lately about whether schools should reopen, with President Trump even suggesting withholding federal funding from schools which don't open completely for in-person learning. Do you think schools need to reopen in the fall? And if so, do you think the government should provide increased funding for them to reopen safely?
So I know you all at San Diego State were probably one of the first schools to decide not to reopen physically in the fall. And I actually think in a lot of ways having that early decision was probably helpful just in terms of planning, which I'm hearing from so many parents and students that it's the uncertainty that is part of the challenge. It's a really difficult question, and I think I really feel for school administrators who are having to weigh all these issues. I feel for teachers who are afraid to go to school, and I feel for parents who are really struggling with what to do now that they have to work and have their kids at home and make sure that their kids are learning and also getting all of the other things they need. So I think it's a really difficult problem. I actually, in my non-campaign role, serve as a co-chair for a countywide equitable distance learning task force here in San Diego County with the Classrooms of the Future Foundation and in partnership with the County Office of Education. And what we're looking at is whatever the school districts and public health officers decide, what are the foundational things we need in place to make sure that whatever that decision is, students are getting equitable access to learning. So looking at connectivity and devices, but also how we're engaging parents and caregivers, what kinds of training the teachers are getting in terms of technology and distance learning, how we can make sure that students have a safe place to learn, and whether that's because their parent or caregiver is an essential worker and so they cannot be home alone, or because they live in a place that is not conducive to learning. How can we make sure we're supporting our childcare and out-of-school time providers who are now going to be handling much more of the burden of education and making sure that they're getting the support they need to do that.
Wonderful. All right, I have one more question for you, if you don't mind.
Of
You've
course.
stated your support for Medicare for All, universal pre-K, tuition-free community college, student loan debt forgiveness programs, increased federal funding for housing and mental health services, among other social programs. Now, these are all good policies that will benefit a lot of people, but with the deficit the government has already incurred in recent years, how do you plan on sustaining such a budget?
There's a few different parts to this answer. So the first is that right now we have historically low interest rates. And I actually think that right now we're more at risk of not spending the money we need to to improve our economy, then we are of spending too much. And I say that having learned from 2008, 2009, that actually one of the worst things for our deficit is a very sluggish recovery, and that actually not spending the money we needed to for stimulus early in that crisis prolonged the recovery, and also that means prolonged our lowered tax base. The second is that we need to repeal the 2017 Republican tax bill that increased the deficit, but in my opinion, did nothing to improve our economy. And we need to close the loopholes. We need to raise taxes, make sure that the highest marginal income tax is the same as capital gains tax. We need to make sure that everyone is paying their fair share in taxes. And lastly, if you ask any business person, they'll tell you that if you are weighing whether to take on debt to do a capital expenditure that's going to improve your growth over time, they'll take that every time. And so we don't just need to be looking at the baseline debt to programs, but what we're spending money on. And we need to be spending money on things like universal pre-K, on things like health coverage, on things like college, because that actually improves our economy, which means we'll actually have more tax base down the road. And Harvard did a study of a number of different policies and what their return on investment is for the government treasury. And programs like that, and especially the ones in early childhood years, actually have an ROI. So the government makes more money on them down the road in the improved wages of the people who participated, et cetera, than it spends on the program. So it's really a question of reframing the time horizon that we're looking at.
All right, thank you so much. Sara Jacobs, candidate for California's 53rd. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. Good luck in November.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.